Okay, I guess we can start now. Good evening and welcome to Careers in Climate. I'm Lynn Lander, a Cooper alumnus from the chemical engineering class of 1960 and a former Cooper trustee. Tonight's event has been organized by the Cooper Union Climate Initiative, or CUSI as we like to call it. CUSI is an alumni affinity group that was started by Marshall Rafal from the class of 1963 and a recently installed Cooper trustee. Organizing this event would not have been possible without the help of the Cooper administration. And these people that you see on the screen did a lot of work to make this happen. And we're very grateful to them because this would not have taken place without their help. Let me say a few words about CUSI. Our near-term objectives for this group that's in its infancy right now is, one, to promote awareness of climate issues among the alumni, and secondly, to identify alumni who work on mitigating climate problems and connect them with Cooper students. And that has two components. One is making students aware of career opportunities in the many climate-related fields, and also to provide internships in climate work and eventually jobs. Here's the agenda for tonight's meeting. I won't spend a lot of time on this, but just to give you an idea of what's happening. We'll have the panel discussion, we'll end with Q&A, and then there'll be some refreshments out in the lobby afterwards. I don't know about you, but I get a ton of junk mail. And lately, in the run-up to elections, I've been getting a lot of political surveys about the issues that I regard as important. They usually list about 15 issues, and I look at them, and every one of them is important. But for me, the most important issue of our time is climate change. And I look at it from a risk management point of view. So when assessing risk, there are two factors that we need to consider. The probability of a negative outcome. Come on. All right, I have to do it this way. And the impact of a negative outcome, or magnitude of it. 50 years ago, when a broad awareness of climate change was beginning to be understood, the probability of a serious climate issue was considered low to moderate, and the magnitude was not at all obvious. But today, it's generally agreed by scientists that absent major successes at mitigation, the probability is very high, and the impact, somewhere up there, poses an existential threat to humanity, but not only to humanity, but all of Earth, both animal and plant. But don't worry, because the Earth will repair itself in a few 100,000 years. For starters, let me identify the three major sources of CO2 emissions. Fossil fuels, construction and buildings, including highways, bridges, dams, factories, and agriculture. For a finer breakdown of the carbon dioxide sources, read Drawdown, edited by Paul Hawken. At the end of my talk, I'll list all the books that I've cited in the talk, so you don't need to write it down. In his recent book, The Heat Will Kill You First, Jeff Goodell tells us, thanks to decades of innovation, clean energy is now cheaper than fossil fuel energy in most parts of the world. That means we now have the means to lift hundreds of millions of people out of energy poverty without relying on coal, gas, or oil. But right now, our dependence on fossil fuels is all about inertia, political will, and big oil and gas companies wanting to milk their investments for as long as they can, end quote. It's clear that it will be a while before CO2 emissions reach net zero, and that means that global warming will continue to get worse before it gets better. The global warming system has considerable lag time built into it, so even after we reach net zero carbon dioxide emissions, warming will continue for some time. In New York, in the New York metropolitan area, we live in what Jeff Goodell calls the Goldilocks zone. That is, the region with relatively little life-threatening climate consequences. Those who live in the hottest climates, the poor who live in substandard housing without air conditioning, those whose livelihood depends on working outdoors, many without access to drinking water and rest breaks, are vulnerable to heat stroke. And make no mistake, heat stroke is a life-threatening condition, and the number of people succumbing to heat stroke every year is increasing. As global warming increases, the Goldilocks zones are shrinking and moving towards the pole and higher altitudes. Those who can will migrate to safer places, leaving the poor and vulnerable to suffer. So in addition to eliminating CO2 and other greenhouse gases, we need technologies and policies to manage life on a warmer planet. We also recognize that some fossil fuel use will be needed as we build out renewable energy sources and infrastructure. Therefore, it's necessary to also implement technologies that minimize CO2 emissions from fossil fuel use. But, and it's a big but, that must not be an excuse to slow progress towards renewable energy. There are those who say that solutions to global warming are too expensive and unproven. I have several responses to that argument. Some analysts have ignored hidden costs. For example, when calculating the environmental impact of gasoline for cars and trucks, you have to include not only CO2 emissions from vehicles, but everything in the supply chain: oil drilling, refining, shipping gas from the refinery to the gas stations, all of those things and more. Similarly, improving the efficiency of energy use, like electric vehicles and efficient heating and cooling of buildings, has limited value if the electricity is generated from fossil fuels. When calculating the cost of a product, rarely considered is the cost to society of dealing with the effects caused by emitting CO2. And who pays the cost for global warming? Indirectly, we all do. Through our taxes, we pay for firefighters, emergency workers, medical staff, and hospital workers. Disaster relief is very expensive in both financial terms and labor. Politicians and regulators have tried carrots and sticks. So far, sticks like carbon tax have been mostly ineffective. Carrots lately have shown some promise, although there's political pushback. I suggest we need both carrots and effective sticks. Another problem we have to deal with if we hope to control global warming is pessimism. I'm just one person. I can't change the world. I quote Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, a marine biologist, climate activist, and inspiring public speaker. She asks, how do we face the truth of what is at stake and how much there is to do? How do we muster up the courage not to give up in spite of the odds? How do we focus on solutions and on what each of us can do to help turn things around? Johnson recommends that you don't try to save the world on your own. That will set you up for failure. Grab onto a manageable piece of the problem and tackle it with vigor, along with like-minded people. Kusi is an example of like-minded Cooper alumni trying to do just this. In her excellent book, Reimagining Capitalism in a World on Fire, Rebecca Henderson, university professor at Harvard, provides many case studies of companies that improve their business results by committing to innovative and sustainable practices. These stories break the myth that sustainability and profit are inevitably antithetical. She showed that sometimes these changes were driven at the top by enlightened CEOs who were willing to forego quarterly profit for achieving long-term success. She provides many examples of change driven by employees who see opportunities for improvement and are willing to doggedly pursue them. This meshes well with Ayanna Johnson's imperative that we can all find ways to have a positive effect on climate crisis. Cooper students are among society's most brilliant young people. You guys know that. I hope that today's program will encourage many of you to develop careers in which mitigating climate change will be your life's work. Our program tonight is just a glimpse of things that Cooper alumni are doing in the climate field. Marshall and I and the CUSI group are planning to bring more Cooper alumni to work on who work in the climate field to provide windows on some of the many areas that you can have an impact, and every aspect of climate change has unique opportunities and requires unique skill sets. I know that this will not be for all of you, but I hope that all of you will accept my challenge to have a positive effect on climate change. That effort can take many forms, both from your work and your private life. Marshall and I are in our 80s. We will not see the worst of climate problems, but we worry about our children and especially our grandchildren, many of whom will be around at the turn of the 22nd century. What is done in the few decades that can put Earth on a path, will be done in the next few decades, can put Earth on a path to healing or to disaster, and I vote for healing. Here's a slide which you can tune into later that captures the books that I spoke about. And here's a link to the CUSI Climate Library, which is on the Cooper web and has more books and articles and what do you call it? Podcasts, thank you. And we'll be adding to it all the time. So now I will get off my soapbox, and I would like to introduce Marshall Rafal, founder of CUSI and a current Cooper trustee, who will tell you about his journey in climate work, and then Marshall will be the moderator of our panel of 2 architecture alumni and 2 engineering alumni. We do not tonight have any art alums on the podium, but we're working on bringing more art alumni into our CUSI group, and then intend to also have some of them speak to you about their journeys in climate. Thank you for coming, and I hope you enjoy tonight's program.
Let me start by thanking Lynn for an excellent talk kicking off tonight's event. Lynn graduated 3 years before me, and we have no recollection of having met until about a year ago. CUSI may have been initiated by me, but there is no doubt that without Lynn's collaboration, this enterprise would not have been realized to the extent that it has. As Lynn mentioned, I am Marshall Rafal, Chem E'63 and co-founder of CUSI. In becoming literate about our climate crisis, one inevitably learns that construction and operation of buildings is one of the largest contributors to CO2 emissions. Fossil fuels and agriculture are the other 2 largest contributors, as Lynn has mentioned. The need to have the best engineers and architects addressing our global crisis is apparent. How extraordinary is it that Cooper Union provides a superb undergraduate education in both fields? Lynn and I believe that there will inevitably be an increasing and evolving collaboration between these 2 schools in the coming years, not to mention the unique role that can be played by artists in expressing the global crisis in their own unique way. With me tonight are 4 extraordinary alumni that I feel privileged to know. They will share their climate-related journeys, starting with their undergraduate work at Cooper Union shortly. But first, before we get into the core of the panel discussion, I'd like to set the stage by talking briefly about my own journey from Cooper to this moment standing before you tonight. In 1959, during the 100th anniversary of the founding of Cooper Union, I entered Cooper as a 17-year-old son of an immigrant who aspired to fulfill my family's pursuit of the American dream. In 1963, in my final semester, Cooper Union received its first ever digital computer. the glorified abacus known as an IBM 1620, provided solely for the use of graduating chemical engineering seniors. The world was just 15 years into the digital age. As a graduating senior, I was figuring out how to utilize my education. It was clear to me then that I had a passion for mathematics and physics, but my career path remained uncertain. The IBM 1620 and I bonded powerfully that spring of '63, and my success in programming in Fortran 2 led to my being recommended by the department for a summer internship in computer modeling of chemical engineering processes at SO Engineering. This experience served as an excellent springboard for my master's and PhD work at Northwestern, where I graduated in 1966 after utilizing a computer to simulate complex chemical engineering unit operations. Not surprisingly, I landed a job in computer simulation at SO Math and Systems, where I stayed for 5 years, leaving in 1971 to found OLI Systems, Inc., a chemical engineering software company with a unique niche in simulating electrolytic chemical systems. When I started in 1971, I was driven by a multi-generational entrepreneurial gene, that's a mouthful, along with a stubborn belief that I could figure everything out based upon a vision of product software and my own capabilities as a software developer honed over 8 years, starting with the spring of '63. 4 months into this journey, I was running out of my meager funds, and at that point, I spent my days pursuing access to a computer on which to develop the software. The cost of such computers was in the millions of dollars, and my nights were spent driving a New York City taxi cab. One day short of my 30th birthday, I met a person who understood my vision and provided me with access to a then modern IBM 360. His company provided seed funding for my business and access to their computers during non-prime nighttime hours. My career as a New York City cab driver was then over, and the rest is history. Today, 52 years into its journey, OLI is heavily involved in applying its software to all manner of projects involving sustainability, ranging from decarbonization, carbon capture, transportation and storage, water treatment, air quality, lithium refining, lithium-ion battery production, battery recycling, corrosion and geothermal wells, and energy storage. A recent success story typifies the application of OLI software to sustainability. OLI was part of a competitive bid under the U.S. Small Business Innovative Research, or SBIR program, to design and build a lithium extraction and lithium hydroxide purification plant from geothermal brines in the Salton Sea, a highly saline, landlocked body of water in Southern California. This to support the transition to battery-powered vehicles. Our job was to develop a comprehensive simulation model of this process to support the design and operation of the plant. This extraction plant was the first of its type ever and is now operating successfully. In a larger sense, this project was a culmination of a 10-year partnership between OLI Systems and DOE's Center for Critical Materials, CMI. CMI was created to reestablish U.S. ability to extract, purify, and manufacture rare earth metals and lithium in conjunction with the transition from fossil fuels to electric without dependence upon China to refine these metals and others as a source of these materials. All of this is an essential step in addressing climate change derived from fossil fuels. Today, I remain as OLI's chairman, and I'm delighted to report that OLI will be supporting a summer internship for one Cooper Union chemical engineering student starting this coming summer. Following my retirement in 2017, I reconnected with Cooper both as a donor and a guest lecturer, providing an annual lecture in Professor Amanda Simpson's advanced thermo class. The discovery of a mutual passion that Amanda and I had for climate science and the literature of climate then led to Amanda's idea, her idea, of forming an alumni affinity group, and that has now come to be realized in the form of CUSI, established, and we are so grateful with the cooperation of Alumni Affairs. My career path, starting at Cooper, programming my first digital computer as a senior and completing a 47-year career as the CEO of OLI Systems, was quite linear. The members of our esteemed panel here with us tonight have their own stories, and I think you will find them quite varied and quite compelling. Thank you. Okay, the way we're going to go about this is I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give you like a 1-minute introduction, their name, degree, year, where they grew up, and where they live. So, Alon?
Good evening. Alon Dominitz. Thank you all for coming. I was born in Israel. I lived there until I was about 7, and then moved to the United States. I spent most of my childhood in Mount Vernon, just north of the city here. And about 20 years ago, moved to Albany, where I live today. We programmed in Fortran 77, which I don't know if it was much better, but
it was.
Hi, my name's Chris Benedict. I am AR'86, architecture 1986, but I started in the art school in 1978. So I suppose maybe art is represented on a tiny basis here. I grew up in Connecticut, and I live and work here in the East Village.
Good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here. My name's Frank Jakob, mechanical engineering 1976, in the combination of well, I started in math in freshman year, and I loved it, but I didn't see a future in it for a career. So I went to physics, and the same thing happened by my sophomore year. I was in mechanical engineering and thermodynamics, heat transfer, fluid mechanics. If you know, those are the three things. That's the primitive way we make electricity. We burn something, make it hot, and then we make electricity from it. Today it's renewable, it's solid state solar. It's wind-driven gearboxes for generators. And you'll hear more about that later. Being from New York City, it's not always popular to say that when you're in the Midwest or on the West Coast. So I've always been telling people, I was born on a small island off the coast of North America. It's a lot more romantic. That's Staten Island. Took the ferry to work every day. Went to California for my graduate degree, and I ended up in Columbus, Ohio for my first job. That lasted 35 years. And it was a varied career in research and development and applied engineering. I'm now living in Kansas City, Missouri. I went to work for a firm in Kansas City, Kansas. You'll hear about later. And also, a family member of mine is associated with Cooper Union. My nephew, by my oldest brother, he met a beautiful woman from Venezuela. They got married. They have a young son. And Marie was a PhD architect from Venezuela, not recognized in the United States. But thanks to Cooper Union and the immigrant education program that they operate here, she's been gaining her career back. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Good evening. My name is Pamela Cabrera. I am an architect and climate engineer. I am from Peru. I was born and raised in Lima and came to the U.S. Just a year before starting Cooper. I went to a senior high, a design and architecture senior high in Miami for a year and a half, where I did also some art. And I graduated from the architecture school in 2012. And then I received a master's at Harvard in 2019.
Okay, thank you. Well, in much the way that I spoke about the arc of my career from Cooper into climate, each of our panelists will now talk in more depth, specifically about their career in climate, discussing what aspect of climate work they've been involved in or are now actively engaged in. And again, I'll start with Alon.
Thanks. So I just want to start off by saying I just speak for myself because I work for New York State, so I just want to be clear that I don't speak for my employer. So I graduated Cooper, I got a job with the state. I was always interested in public service, and I worked here in the 5 boroughs regulating nitrogen oxide emissions from stationary combustion sources. Basically every power plant in the city except for the Con Ed plants, all the smaller plants. Got my PE, interviewed for a job on a lark in Albany, and it was in dam safety, which I never heard of before. Ended up getting that job as a senior engineer, and I was a senior engineer there for 5 years and eventually became section chief of that program. The job of that program is to have standards for both design and operation of dams and do inspections and things like that to stop dams from failing, stop the kind of incidents that we've seen in Libya very recently with very tragic results. So I spent over 20 years in dam safety, and during those 20 years, the floods got more frequent and they got worse. And I was always interested in the environment, and I started to realize that climate change is not something that's coming, climate change is here, and I was dealing with it. So I was very fortunate to have some opportunities to work on several climate change projects that the state had over time. One of the first ones was that the state had an initiative to kind of a first of its kind effort to figure out what the climate change impacts could be to different sectors of society in New York and what some adaptation strategies might be. So in 2010, I was the Water Resources Technical Chair for a report that came out that was eventually called the draft, I believe it was called the Draft Climate Action Plan. I also was very lucky to be on the steering committee for a study that updated rainfall maps. So up until that time, the rainfall maps that were used to design different water infrastructure were from 1963 and represented about 40 years of data prior to 1963. So I worked with the state climatologist's office, which is at Cornell University, and I kind of represented the end user of this product that we ended up creating that was updated rainfall maps. I'm very proud of that, still used today. You can look online, it's called precip.net, and you can get that data. And then I was also on a steering committee through NYSERDA to look at, okay, we have these global climate models that say the climate's going to change. How do we downscale that to New York State? And then further, how do we actually use that data to drill down and actually come up with design level data to say, well, what are the rainfall maps going to look like 50, 75, 100 years from now? So that was a very exciting project too. About a year and a half ago, I got a great opportunity to start a new job at a relatively new state agency called the Office of Renewable Energy Siting. So I'm the civil engineering manager there now. That office does siting permits for major renewable energy projects. In general terms, major is defined as over 25 megawatts, but a lot of our projects are sort of in the 100 megawatt and above range. We also permit battery energy storage and transmission lines associated with those projects. So just to give you an idea of what a 100 megawatt solar facility looks like, 100 megawatts of solar panels is about 500 acres of solar panels. So of course, we're New York State. We don't just say we're going to pave some area over with 500 acres of panels. What our agency does is try to make sure that these projects are sited appropriately, we have 25 different subject areas that we look at to say, is this project, have they minimized, mitigated, and avoided the impacts from the placement of these projects. So it's if you think of like the scale of like rooftop solar, and then you might have some ground-mounted solar, we're at the very top of that scale. This is like utility scale projects. New York has a goal of using 70% renewable energy by 2030, so we're a very critical piece of that goal. So we like to say, New York is at the forefront of fighting climate change, and our agency is at the forefront of New York's fight against climate change. So it's a very exciting place to be. It's very challenging to kind of make sure that these things are built out while minimizing all the impacts. It's the other exciting piece of it is that we have a tremendous number of experts in a variety of different fields, and I work with all of them, and it's just a fantastic group of people who are very dedicated to this this subject.
Thank you, Alon. I'd remind everybody, all these journeys started with a number of years here
Absolutely.
at Cooper Union, and it's very memorable for all of us. Okay, Chris?
I'd just like to quickly ask, how many architects, how many engineers? Whoa! Okay. How many art students? Yay!
All right.
Okay, great. Sorry, I gave up some of my minutes to find that out. On the first Earth Day, I was a kid walking around with my family, picking up garbage on the side of the road, and then seeing in the following week that there was just more garbage there. And I just couldn't understand, like, how could this be? How could we pump all the smoke out of smokestacks and not do anything about it? Why aren't the adults doing anything? So now I'm an adult, and I'm in a career where I can do something about it. And it's been an incredibly satisfying journey for me. So I started in the art school at Cooper Union. 2 years in, there was a course offered by one of the engineering professors. I think his name was Jean Lemay. And it was a course called Alternative Technologies, where they brought together art, architecture, and engineering students together to form a project. And we chose this crazy abandoned building over on East 3rd Street, and we opened up the plywood off the door and went in and went down to the city to see if we could buy the building, and we figured out all kinds of things that we could do with this building. But while I was doing this, I was hanging out with a lot of architects and saw that, hey, maybe this is really where I should be. So I interviewed with John Haydick, who was the dean of the architecture school at the time, and he let me come in. So I graduated in '86. But I had a little bit of a rough time in architecture school, so I took a little time off. I took a motorcycle, rode across country and back. I lived a kind of arty life in the East Village, and then finally buckled down, and over the next couple years worked in 4 different architecture firms. Most of that work was for affordable housing, low-income housing, special needs housing. And in each one of those offices, I would say, hey, we're doing all this stuff for society. Why aren't we looking at environment? And I was always kind of like pushed away, saying, this isn't really what we do. By a crazy serendipitous coincidence, I was working in a firm, and someone who had been a client of an older employer asked me if I wanted to bring a project that he had into the firm I was working in. And I said, well, why don't you just let me start my own firm? And it's a group called the Enterprise Foundation, now known as Enterprise Community Partners. They're a gigantic housing organization in the United States. It turns out I was the first architect they ever hired, and I was able to start my business. So in 2 weeks, I had an architecture business and work. So that first year, I worked on 13 small buildings in Brooklyn. And at the time, I didn't have any education about really how to look at a building. These 13 buildings, I tried to get some recycled materials into them, but I had bigger dreams. About a year into my office, I attended a conference where I met my now work partner, Henry Gifford, who was a mechanical system designer. And he started to take me around to the buildings that he had replaced boilers in. And some of them were the buildings that were the buildings my previous firms had been the architect for. So it was a real eye-opener to see that very classic mistakes were being made in these boiler rooms that could be avoided. We decided to start working together. And then after that, I started to meet a lot of building science people, people at the national labs. And I literally chased after these people, trying to get them to tell me everything that they could teach me about building science. And what kind of came to me after all of that was, buildings are like bodies. They interact. They, taking a holistic view, kind of the same way that you would look at holistic medicine, is how we need to look at buildings. And so I developed something called the system approach, which is now very well known. Everyone's practicing it. I had taken all those pieces and put them together and kind of started to deploy it right away. So I got a second group of buildings, and this group of buildings, I knew the things I had to do. I invited all my new building science and national lab friends to come and see it, and they were just like, what? Who is this person? Who we tell her something, she goes and does it? Whoa. So I got a lot of credibility. And I have to say, as I move forward in my career, I'm always trying to find the hardest jobs to do, the jobs that need to be done, that no one is actually doing. For instance, currently, I've just completed 9 existing tenant-in-place buildings, bringing them to Passive House with a protocol that I developed to make that happen. And so, you know, I've stood on the shoulders of giants who helped me do all of this. And I can only say that, you know, you can't really plan a career, but you can be really brave, really courageous, and willing to take some risks, and you will have a dynamite life.
Wow, thank you.
Thank you, Chris. You mentioned passive as a word. What you meant was passive solar energy sort of buildings?
No, Passive House, the
Passive
Passive
House.
House protocol.
Okay, interesting.
Okay, Frank?
Oh, okay. I'm going to give you a little history lesson and then talk about my career living up to that history. In the 1970s, climate wasn't a thing. What was a thing was called the oil crisis. The Middle East cut back on production and they starved the world for oil. Your parents stood in line for hours to get gasoline at gas stations back in the 1970s. My parents did. I walked by them to school because the buses didn't have oil. We've since worked out those politics, and things are still a little rough sometimes, but we haven't had such an incident since. But it was the early 1970s. The politics were like recently, you know, narrow Democratic control of Congress. Jimmy Carter was president. What he established and has been a launching element for a lot of innovation in energy was he took all the energy pieces being done by the Interior Department, the Post Office was doing, and in fact the greatest simulation program of the 1960s for buildings was built by the Post Office for their big warehouses and all the energy that they were using. And he took all those pieces and put it together into what was then called the Solar Energy Research Institute, SERI, that has since become the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, NREL, and it's grown in its scope, but all those things happen. So a precursor to climate change today in the 70s was conservation and energy efficiency. For my career, energy efficiency has been most often a core element of what it was I was doing. Energy transformation systems that take fossil fuel or electricity and convert it into something, and that something is a service. Anybody here want to buy electricity? Anybody here want to buy natural gas or gasoline? No, you want to drive, you want the lights on, you want your beer cold, you want your water hot, you want your internet, you want services. And it's those services that get delivered in one fashion by these many things that we've used that have since been contributing to climate change. So if we can invent new ways to deliver those services without that core aspect, we've got a solution. And that's what I'm hoping that I and my panelists inspire you to today. I worked in material science. Furnaces of the 1970s were about 80% efficient. That's as high as they could go, because if you know about combustion, what happens is you take hydrogen and carbon, a hydrocarbon, fossil fuel, and you take oxygen from the air, and you make two things. You make carbon and oxygen, carbon dioxide, and you make hydrogen and oxygen, which is water. It turns out to be water vapor. So about 20% of the energy content of what you burn is actually water vapor. You can't get it out as temperature change. And so coming up with materials that would be able to withstand that corrosive water vapor, because there are sulfides in the air and other things, is what has enabled us today to have furnaces that are 95% efficient and better. They squeeze out the water in a secondary heat exchanger, and you'll see that dribble in and out of your system in your apartment or at home if it's there. Just like your air conditioner squeezes water out of the air, humidity out of the air, and does the same thing. I went on to work in what was called the smart grid. The grid's pretty dumb. Generation's very smart. It's able to follow the changing loads, and the loads change all the time. You turn on your lights, your neighbor does, you turn it off. And so stable generation was engineeringly feasible in central sites, but the loads were varying. Well, with renewable energy, we now have solar, which naturally varies at least night to day, if not hour to hour, and wind, which varies all the time. And so we're compounding that effect of variable generation and variable wind. And so this thing called the smart grid, a lot of the research of the late 2000s were in that domain. I worked with American Electric Power and some Department of Energy firms. And what's being implemented today are outcomes of that's able to match the power grid and its generation capability to what the loads are doing. Finally, my last career element, it circled back to my first, conservation and energy efficiency. I was looking for I had dabbled in sustainability and I always worked in efficiency, but never particularly clean. And then I wanted to work exclusively in renewable energy. My wife had previously, for her career, had moved to Kansas City, from where we were living then in Ohio. And then as I was looking for a career change, this is 2015, I found engineering firms there throughout Kansas City. If you're really interested in sharp engineering that's coupled with low-cost procurement and effective construction, these EPC firms do that. And I looked at several in the area. There are at least a half a dozen. The one I landed with was called Black & Veatch, and that's because the president of the growing renewable energy group saw the need to match variable renewable generation with variable loads, and to do that through battery energy storage. And we started that ourselves then. It had barely been done on the grid by then. It's now one of the fastest growing elements. That is the batteries in your cell phones and computers. You might have one or two. Batteries in your car, if you've got an electric vehicle or a scooter, you might have 4, 5, or 6. These are shipping containers full of tens of thousands of the same cells, same lithium-ion cells. And so that economy of scale achieves what is now affordable in putting lithium-ion batteries on the grid to match them with the load. I'm really thrilled to be here in my hometown and a chance to be back at Cooper Union and speak to you all this evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. And last but not least, as the saying goes, Pamela,
Thank you, Marshall.
Sure.
It's really nice seeing some familiar faces. I have to say I'm currently a senior associate at Transsolar Klima Engineering, but I'm also an assistant adjunct professor here at the Cooper Union in the architecture school. I teach a third-year required course called Environmental Technologies, and I'm also part of some of the studio work and assist with that. And I mentioned that because once I realized I was going to move back to New York City, I really wanted to engage back with Cooper Union. And I only graduated 11 years ago, so in 2012. And up to the last year here as a student in Cooper Union, no one talked about climate change. And that's surprising to hear that that wasn't brought up within studio work or within different courses. There was also very little interaction between schools. So we were talking back then about the threat of Cooper Union's full tuition scholarship, the changing governance, the unique education of Cooper, and of course the architecture school was still deeply rooted in Hayduk's legacy. The projects were about form, terraforming landscape, the human scale, urban scale, technology and tectonics, and parametric design, but really no one was tackling climate change. I remember the first course about the environment, and it was the year I was graduating, and I had a conflict, I couldn't take it, by Lydia Calapoliti, who people know here. But as a whole, there was no active engagement. There was no talk about energy use in buildings, and of course, no reference to carbon. But it's still, here I learned how to ground buildings, how architecture interacts with climate and responds to specific site conditions, about light, air, sound, the earth. So of course, I learned things that I still practice today. And since then, I can say I was always deeply interested about the performance of architecture, how it creates place, and also learn about good design. But I can say then that my career in climate really started after I graduated. I wanted to respond to the most important issue of our time. What should architecture become? What is the agency of us architects to change and adapt? So as soon as I graduated from Cooper, I had the opportunity to design a house in Lima, in Pachacamac, the outskirts of Lima in Peru. So I just packed my things and went back to Peru, having designed one building, and was able to design this house on the hills of a mountain with natural ventilation, great daylight, no active heating or cooling. It was what you call a passive house, and it's actually off the grid. Of course, the climate there helps a lot. It's a really mild and comfortable climate, so it wasn't really a big task. But of course, a really good start for a recent grad. So after that, I thought I really needed experience and came back to New York. And I work for a Cooper alum with more Cooper grads. I always surrounded myself with Cooper people. And after a couple years, I went back to Peru and founded my own firm with my partner, where we worked for 3 years. So we rooted there our work and craft. We work closely with artisans, with local materials and local knowledge. I also joined a nonprofit organization, Construir Identidad, that worked with indigenous communities and research vernacular architecture. And I saw firsthand communities that didn't have access to basic services like energy, electricity, or water. But I also learned a lot about indigenous communities, about their forms of building, and their respectful circular ways with the environment. So I'm still deeply inspired by vernacular architecture and indigenous knowledge. So I became deeply engaged with climate issues and strived for architectures that had positive impact to the environment. I wanted to challenge closed-minded engineers that I was working with, so I decided to go back to school. And came back to the US. I went to pursue a master's in design studies in energy and environment at Harvard University within the Graduate School of Design. It was completely different from Cooper. No studios, it was all based on research and science, maybe some policy. It was a perfect program for me because it allowed me to do forge my own path and have a lot of flexibility of what to take. With the resources of both Harvard and MIT at the heart of Cambridge, it was great. There, my experience was completely different. It was centered on climate change. I wanted to tackle the issue head straight. And my career there was closely related to material science as well. My thesis was on passive dehumidification, looking at I spent countless hours inside labs making membranes to tackle how to do dehumidification in a different way that use less energy intensive methods. And this membrane dehumidification offered an isothermal way of dehumidifying air, so it was so exciting to me. But what I wanted to do was incorporate that into building elements like screens, walls. How can possibly dehumidification be part of the repertoire of strategies that you could do in a passive building design? And that's where I decided to continue a career between design and engineering. And it was only learning through what Transsolar did that I really found a place to pursue that type of work. That project of my thesis took its own legs, and we've received a grant from the Department of Energy to continue it. And to this day, there's still in research and development with so many people involved now. My both advisors from both Harvard, MIT, and the main PI now from Princeton, who just came to my final review, saw my project, and the next day was like, okay, we need to submit an application to get a grant from the Department of Energy, and we did it. So Transsolar had been on my radar for a couple of years because I assisted as a teaching assistant to one of the directors that came to Harvard to teach a course in the landscape studio. And we hit it off, and before I knew it, I was interviewing for a position before I was graduating. For those who don't know Transsolar, it's a climate engineering firm where consultants in the scale of architecture and design. And our work centers in building physics and the thermodynamic simulation to design climate conditions between interior and exterior spaces, minimize energy use, and our focus to minimize carbon emissions. So our projects strive to have carbon neutral goals and positive environmental impact. Thank you. I don't think I'm almost out of time.
Thank you. Thank you all, panelists. Timing was perfect. I didn't see our timekeeper raise any objections. Now, we're going to do a more of a quick thing, and I'm actually going to start with Pamela this time because we waited a long time to get to her, so we're going to go in reverse order.
I think that's for water.
You need a drink of water.
Yeah.
You didn't know that was coming, Pamela. Yeah. I should have told you. Anyway, I'll draw it out. Please, each of you, provide an example of one or more specific successful climate projects with which you have been involved. And we're going to do 3 minutes each.
Great, thank you. So I wanted to speak about 2 projects that are right now in construction. They're one of my first projects I started at Transsolar, but they're in very different size and program and team composition. The first is a new science and laboratory building at the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. It's the Vagelos Institute of Energy, Science, and Technology. So for this project, we work with Danish Architekten. They're also a German firm. Transsolar is a German firm. They're both from Stuttgart, so we have a really close connection, and we work really, really well. The mechanical engineers are Van Selm engineers, and the structural engineers, Knippers Helbig. It's a $173 million facility with 113 square feet of laboratory space. It's a heavy lab building. So I chose this because it's one of the most energy-intensive type of programs, but it also is one of types of buildings that we should try to focus energy-saving strategies to reduce because it's also critical to be able to solve the climate change crisis. Having worked in lab myself, I know that they're an energy hog in universities, and it's a challenge to design high-performing, efficient labs. Now, the final design for Vagelos provides a 63% energy use savings from the code-required baseline of ASHRAE 90.1. So it actually achieves the maximum amount of points that you can get for energy high-performance building from LEED. And this was only possible to key strategies. For labs, one of the most intensive areas of energy use is for ventilation. It requires so many air changes to be able to provide the air quality required in the labs. So strategies about, we had a really good heat recovery system, which is a Convecta recovery system that doesn't allow cross-contamination between the exhaust, which is really contaminate from labs. We also looked at reducing the air changes requirements in the labs, taking a close look at the fuel pump design, and also the air cascading from non-lab spaces into lab spaces. Now, all these things related to the energy use in the buildings, that also, another thing related to that is the water to water heat pumps that are tied into the chilled water, the campus chilled water, to do simultaneous heating and cooling. But Transsolar in our work not only looks at the high performance energy strategies related to the equipment, but also to the human scale and human habitat. So even though it's a large laboratory building, we also focus to create decent spaces that had access to daylight and natural ventilation. So actually all non-lab spaces, including the write-up spaces of all the chemists, have natural ventilation design. And the facade was a key ingredient to allow basically a holistic heating and cooling strategy in the offices to have radiant panels instead of an all-air system. I think I'm almost out of time, but the second project I wanted to mention is the Teca Capimec contestation in Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument. It's a very small project. It's a visitor center. It's only 8,000 square feet, and it's completely off the grid. So for that project, we worked with a local team. We actually had a deep engagement with the Boabanaki Council, which is relates to the Penobscot culture of 11,000 years of that area, so that the culture and is projected into the building, and it could be also be respectful of the land. Now, the sustainability strategies there, which is in the northern tip of Maine, include no active cooling, so it's all done with just passive natural ventilation and thermal mass. And thermal mass also plays a key role for passive heating strategies in the winter. All the electricity is made on site with batteries and panels.
These are really tough to squeeze into
I know, I'm
three
sorry.
minutes. Frank, do your best.
Thank you. My favorite project was a study, but it was such a profound concept. It was after that energy crisis I talked about earlier. It was in the 1980s, and things had been ironed over, so there was a jointly funded project between the United States Department of Energy and the Saudi Arabian government. And what it was called the solar-powered greenhouse. What it was a greenhouse to grow an energy-conserving, water-conserving greenhouse to grow vegetables in desert environments. Water conservation is important because there isn't water to keep the plants watered. And heating and cooling are important because you can't overheat these delicate plants. And the concept was basically the building was transparent, clear plastic panels that had channels in them, and that there was a liquid that was graded from clear, in which case all the sun would come through for photosynthesis for the plants, to gray, in which the fluid would start absorbing some of the solar and create heat, to black, to where there would be no transparency, such as simulating nighttime, and so we could control the solar insolation during the day. And that heat, what it was used for two purposes: plain old heating to keep things warm in the desert at night, and what's a type of heat pump. That's a device that like your air conditioner, that takes heat out of your home and pumps it outside. That's run with heat. That is, it boils the liquid instead of running a compressor. And so that absorption heat pump, combined with the insulation control, you could tune what solar insolation happens to the type of plants you're growing. Some want more sunlight than others. They grow in southern climates, but you'd be able to grow them in northern climates. And so that's a study that was put on the shelf, but it was so interesting it's got to come back. For practical accomplished studies, think of systems, two systems in particular: a housing complex at a naval base. This is Sewell's Point in North Carolina, and there's 500 homes, single-family homes where the base personnel are living, And there was a lot of energy being used for electric resistance heating. There was a lot of energy being used in inefficient gas water heaters. And so, and they're right there by the ocean. And so it was a perfect confluence of using what are called water source heat pumps. Don't take the energy or deposit the energy into the air, which varies so much from cold to hot, but use the ocean water that's a steady temperature, and then draw the heat out of that in order to do heating in these homes, or pump the heat from the home into this water in order to cool the homes. And then put a heat recovery unit on some of the superheat that comes out of the refrigerant and do the water heating with it like that. So 250, half of those homes were converted to that more efficient system, and on par, they used less than 25% of the energy for those purposes than the homes that weren't changed, kind of the placebo group versus the test group. And then I got the chance to do the same thing with residential houses, to look at the whole system, from the central air conditioning and furnace, through the ductwork, through the grills. There was a hydronic version of that for boilers that heated water in order to heat homes. And one of the incredible discoveries of that project was that people knew ducts were leaky, sheet metal ducts, you kind of duct tape them together and they barely fit together. And about 15 to 25% of the total heat for a residence was being lost into these crawl spaces, lost into these basement areas. Since that time, standards have been established in order to tighten that ductwork, in addition to the efficiency gains that have been made in compressors, in heat exchangers, in combustion, that there's been a great reduction, more than 50%, maybe not as much as 25%, in the energy consumption and thereby the global warming elements of that energy production. But that energy production is still there. There's another great step to be made, and I'm talking with the folks we want to inspire to make it. Thank you.
Thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I decided I would decide last minute which project to talk about, and I still haven't quite decided. So, I'm going to talk about a job that I just finished, which has been the most challenging job in my life so far. So I invented this job, and it's the job of taking existing buildings with people in them and bringing them to much higher energy efficiency and health. And so I came up with an idea. In building science, the best way to insulate a building is on the outside, because then you keep all that thermal mass inside of the building. It keeps things very steady and solid inside of the building, temperature-wise, but also you don't have problems of condensation inside of your walls. So in the building science world, this is the best way to insulate. And so I got very interested in figuring out how to do this. I did it on a number of new construction buildings, and then I got the idea that if people are in buildings and we want to change out their mechanical systems, why not put them all outside of the building and then clad with this exterior insulation on the outside? And it was an idea that when I gave presentations, I would just say it, tell it, every presentation, until a client that I actually already had said, "Chris, I have a job for you," and gave me 8 buildings to do this with. So we proceeded before COVID to start this job. So we're running mechanical ventilation, heating and cooling with ductless split system units down the outside of a building, first putting an air barrier on it, putting the frames of new windows in the openings, but leaving the existing windows in, very carefully just trying to figure out, how can we just completely approach this building from the outside and not bother people on the interior, and then poke through the building with the ventilation and the refrigerant lines, and then reclad the whole building to make this building be a whole kind of well-performing building. And so we did this. Of course, we had COVID at the same time. There were all kinds of things that happened along the way. And one of the most major things that came out of this was how much people don't want to change their lives. And so I think that this is a gigantic job for us moving forward, because as we're doing this work, we're asking people to make changes in their lives. There's so many issues surrounding this, and so much thinking about how we can make these transitions smooth. And a lot of it is the stuff that happens in between the major moves, and that, to me, that's a clue. Like, now I'm working on a new job. It's in Massachusetts, not in Brooklyn. And this one is a similar job. It's a 147-unit building with existing tenants. But now the goals have gotten higher. We want to do net zero energy, net zero carbon, net zero water. So it's really great to have something that you can just kind of keep building. You keep building your skills, and then you get an opportunity to go to the next level with things. But I do want to say that I think there's a tremendous amount of work out there in helping bringing our world along in this new work that we're doing.
Thank you so much. Alon?
Thanks. So, at my new job, one of the things that's very exciting to me is one of our first project has now gone to construction. It's under construction near Rochester. And I was very involved with that, very involved with the review of the final design for that, and getting that going. So that happened earlier this year, and they started construction about a month or two ago, and it's going very well, so I'm very proud of that. I'm also, in the year and a half that I've been there, the agency in total has issued about 13 permits. I worked on about half of those because I got there after the agency was formed, but it's very much of we're sort of like a startup mentality. It's a very dynamic, exciting place to work. So I'm proud of like the half a dozen or so projects that I've worked on. We have several hundred in the pipeline that are going to come in the next few years. It's going to be a very busy time. One of the things I think, Chris, you kind of touched on a little bit is a lot of, people are very important to all this, right? I mean, the Earth will be fine if it's warmer. We, as people, might not be. So one of the things that I'm proudest of is the role that I have played in putting together this team that I'm part of about 50 people, under 50 people, who are doing this tremendous amount of work in a very short amount of time. I work with biologists, I work with electrical engineers, I work with civil engineers, I work with archaeologists, just a huge variety of agricultural specialists, just a huge variety of people, all working to make sure that the state permits projects that avoid, minimize, and mitigate all these impacts to the greatest extent that we possibly can. So it's very, very challenging to do that. I think everyone here kind of talked about, there are these impacts that what we do have, both positive and negative, but you can't really eliminate the negative impacts on any of the things that we always make decisions, right? We try to maximize the positive impacts, minimize the negative impacts. So to do that is where having a smart human being and a smart team really adds value and provides value to society. And I think that's very much in keeping with Peter Cooper's philosophy informing the school to try to make society a better place. So I'm very proud to be a small part of that.
Well, thank you so much for invoking Peter Cooper and his vision. We have to all remember that. Could I just ask for a round of applause for the panel? These stories are just wonderful for me to hear, and I hope for you. We're just going to do a few, before we get into Q&A, we're just going to do a few kind of toss-out questions to the panel. I'm going to toss one up and see who wants to answer. What advice do you have for Cooper Union students of today, especially if they have an interest in a career in climate? Okay, well, we had two volunteers, you're closest. Alon?
Sure. So I talked about, we always think about climate change as being the mitigation side, trying to prevent climate change. But the reality is, we've seen this summer, I've experienced it firsthand in communities around the state, climate change is here. And even if we were to significantly reduce our carbon emissions today, which we can't do, climate change is not going to go away. So it's going to continue for some time. So I think there's just tremendous opportunity in all the different things that we talked about today, but also in trying to make sure that we as a society can live with the climate change that we know is going to happen. There's a ton of opportunity to look at that side of it and to help build infrastructure, to deal with other things, to make things resilient in the face of sea level rise, increased flooding, increased heat, perhaps increased snow, perhaps colder temperatures in some parts of the state, or the country certainly. So my advice would be, just think in broad terms, think in big terms. And I kind of remember when I was a few years after graduating college here in the late 90s, early 2000s, I think people started saying every business is an internet business, right? And what they meant was if you weren't on the World Wide Web, if you didn't have a website, you weren't going to be able to do business. I think in your lifetime, every job is going to be a climate job. If you're not working directly in climate change, it's going to touch your job somehow. You're going to have to work with materials that consider carbon footprint. Even if you're an artist, you might have to consider your medium and what the carbon footprint of that is. So I think my advice would just be, think outside the box. There's a ton of opportunity to work on all these different issues in a huge variety of ways.
Can I ask for one more panelist to address this? Oh, Pamela?
I'm just going to also reiterate what you say. It's like everyone graduating from Cooper today should work on climate. I mean, this is going to touch your lives and your works after you graduate. Like Alon mentioned, even if today we stopped all emissions, the climate and the weather is still going to increase over time. The temperature is still going to increase because it takes time for all the greenhouse gas emissions to actually trap the heat on Earth. And for the architects, the building sector represents about 42% of the total global emissions. So any building that is built in your lifetime is going to contribute to that, and therefore, you have the agency to change that profession. So you need to think about wide and think wide about the potential impact that you can have, because the architects are going to be needed for designing new types of spaces that can adapt to the future climate.
Okay, I'd like to move to the next question in the interest of time. What aspects of climate change should students consider that they might not be aware of at this point? Anyone? Okay, Frank?
I've been involved in product development at various times, and there's a concept there. It's a simple 2x2 matrix. The rows are known things and unknown things. And the columns are, it is known and it is unknown. So we live in that first square in the matrix. We know what we know, right? As a teenager, middle teenager, you kind of knew everything. Now, in college, maybe you're starting to know what it is you know. And you're also becoming aware of what you don't know and what you got to learn. A test is coming up and it's got double integrals in it, and you got to sharpen up on that. And then there are the unknowns. And there may be unknowns that are known by other people. And that's where this teamwork and collaboration comes in. But where we are with climate change is in that lower right corner. Unknowns. We don't know what the impacts, how profound the impacts are going to be. They've been profound so far. I'm 99% sure they're going to be more profound in the future. And nobody knows a solution. Nobody knows what the solutions are. This isn't tennis or golf where somebody's going to figure it out and get the trophy. This is a team sport. And it's a team sport that's multi-dimensional. And I think you need, and there are three things. There are interests. What are you interested in? There are skills, those things you've learned and have. And what your skill level is. Even though you're skilled, you know what your level is. And the panelists like this, we have these skills that are fundamental in our domains of knowledge and expertise. And if I were to name them, I'd name four. Critical thinking skills. Maybe there's no specific program on that, but I know in physics and math and some of the engineering I took, critical thinking skills to decide and figure out what's happening. You need math. You always need math. Keep on using math. Science, the breadth of science. For me, it's thermodynamics, heat transfer, and fluid mechanics. For others, it's building science. And the fourth one I'm going to name is humanities. You've got to know the humanities. You've got to know culture. You've got to know language. You've got to know people. You've got to know the history if we're going to create solutions for these clients that Chris is working with. Besides the domains that we have in architecture and art and engineering. And do I have 30 seconds more or not?
Ask Lynn.
Skill levels. You've got a skill, but maybe you think you don't have the right level. Well, Notre Dame, that burned down several years ago, was being rebuilt. And a reporter was there to interview some of the construction workers on site. And there was a pile of bricks just delivered, and two guys, a young guy and an old guy, were bringing those bricks over to the journeyman bricklayers. And they asked the young guy, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm bringing those stupid bricks from here to there." And they asked the older guy and said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm building a cathedral." And that's what we want to do. We want to build the cathedral of climate change.
Wow. Thank you. Anybody else on this one?
Yeah, I'd just like to take off on something that Frank was just talking about. You know, there used to be a time when you had this vision of the engineer as somebody who sits in a little room and management slips a problem under the door. The engineer solves it and slips the answer back out under the door. That doesn't work anymore. As Frank mentioned, it's a team sport. And one of the most important things I found in my business career is that you have to learn how to speak to people who work in a different discipline than you, because they have a different language, different biases. And it's incredibly important to be able to collaborate with people from different disciplines. That's where real innovation happens, where the real problems get solved. Because if you can't speak to people from other areas, you don't understand the problem, you solve the wrong problem.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the last of our toss-up questions, which is, how do you see the issue of climate change evolving over the next few decades? What challenges and opportunities do you see? I think we've touched on a lot of this. Chris, would you like to take a shot at that? Or I just volunteered you.
I guess this is riffing a little bit on the last question as well. So this morning, Frank sent out an article to all of us, and it was about New York's Local Law 97 and the pushback on Local Law 97. And, you know, you look at that situation, and here is just pieces of the situation. We have a city with buildings that are over 100 years old sometimes, and then buildings that were built, you know, now or within the last 50 years, all of which used energy in a different way than what we're proposing to use it now. A law that is basically forcing people to do stuff, with landlords feeling pretty persecuted because a bunch of them I know and are my clients. and the amount of change that has to happen in order to actually bring these buildings into some kind of sustainable situation. So this is a problem. This is a problem. This law, I don't think, is ever going to work. That we are not going to be able to force people into this. There's a problem that has to get solved about this whole thing that is meat. So I would say maybe that's not your problem. Maybe there's another problem. You start toying around in your head and things start to click and be surprised and open. And that type of thing can lead you to a lifetime of work. And if not, you can tell somebody else about it. But in any case, we have major problems that are so complex that have to do with social, technical, physical things that, starting to just get the wheels turning. Where's my place in this thing? It's a way to do this.
One of the things that strikes me very powerfully from the readings I've done is to also be aware of this entire planet and the people who inhabit places that are not in the Goldilocks zone, as Lynn spoke about. And, we all need to be sensitive to how the climate crisis is being experienced in different corners of the globe. Does anybody else want to speak on this, or should we move to our audience?
I mentioned humanities. I want to mention art too. To accomplish changing what climate change is happening, I firmly believe we need the art school, just like we needed humanities, to communicate the complexity that was just spoken about, and the communication, the stakeholders that are involved, and getting the point across. And so my challenge, say, to those in art or with an artistic bent in the audience might be not to simply pedantically plagiarize Milton Glaser's I Heart New York and make it I Heart Earth. That's kind of corny. But what's the profound inspiration to inspire others to accomplish these sorts of goals? Because this group could be the seed to make that happen.
Well, I hope we've given our audience some reason to ask a question or two, and I think we're going to donate a couple of microphones. Lynn, you seem to know how to do this. I don't. Whitney, you want to? There you go.
Just take the whole thing. Give to Whitney.
Oh,
She's
was
strong.
that hard? Okay.
So I guess this goes back to what Chris was saying earlier. Excuse me. When you're talking about your project with the insulation, the exterior of homes, you mentioned people are so resistant to change. I'm a sophomore civil engineer right now, and as the climate crisis is upon us. Why are people so resistant to this? Is it purely economic? Is it just an uncertainty of the future? What's going on?
I think people are really stressed right now in the world and in the city. I expect that if I asked, they would say, we have enough to deal with right now. We don't want our house changed. We don't want anything changed. Are you going to raise the rent? Are there, just so many concerns. There's been a very controversial bunch of stuff about switching from gas cooking to electric. We did that. Whoa. That was really tough. We were told that people cannot cook their rice the way they've always cooked it, and they can't figure out how to cook it on the electric stove. We went in and we actually cooked rice. We tried a bunch of experiments with it. But, the people in the buildings I was working in don't have the money to buy bags and bags of rice and try to figure it out. You know, there's just so many things. But when you tell me you're a software engineer, I just see how, you know, this kind of facilitating the change with software in some way, you know, it just makes my light bulb, my light bulb go off.
If I could add to that. So I think we have some vision, we each have some vision of what society needs to look like to deal with climate change. But just to give you an idea, we all had dinner together and the four of us couldn't agree. You know, and we've studied this matter deeply and we had four different opinions. And so when you take that and then you take people, you know, you're working towards somebody's vision or some, you know, group of people's vision of how things need to get, where things need to go. But then when an individual person actually experiences that change that we know needs to happen, you know, it's a very real thing. And they don't necessarily see that end result, right? They're just seeing that this change is happening, I don't know where I'm going with this, and I don't like this change. So I think that really probably is going to be the biggest challenge for the future is, you know, figuring out really where we need to go with this. As I said, we don't have all the answers. If the answers were simple, we'd have them already. And then, you know, how to do that transition, I think is a huge challenge. And it's on an individual level.
If I also want to add to that, because I think that goes at the core of the society issues. Like, actually, we do need to change and we do need to adapt. Like, there's no other options. Climates are going to change. Our buildings are going to get too hot because the climate of New York is going to be more similar to, you know, North Carolina in the future. And I think you're going to resist change and then it's just going to happen from under your feet, like a fire in Maui and just demolishing houses, or with, you know, big thunder, like hurricanes that are in flooding. It's like, I think there has to be a way that we allow the culture and society to be more open to change. I think that's actually critical to solving or just like adapting to climate change, because there's not really like a solution. We just need to adapt and find new ways of design, find new ways of living in our new current state in the world.
I will say that one thing we discovered was that the tenants love their new air conditioning. So now I'm thinking, you know, I have to knock on the door and say, here's your air conditioning, and we do all this other stuff, please. You know, and maybe air conditioning comes first and everything else last.
I mean, I think one of the problems that you're hearing in the responses is that, by and large, most people are not comfortable with change, especially if the change involves something that isn't right in front of their noses. You know, if life is going to be better for you 5 years from now or 10 years from now, people generally aren't compelled by that kind of an argument. It's the stuff right in front of them. That something's going to happen to you next week. You got to do something. So it's a tough psychological problem that all these changes are faced with.
Well, sorry, just one thing. I hope that's a generational issue. I hope new generations are open more to change because they understand the impact in a higher degree.
That's a good point.
Oh, sorry. Hello. On the point of change, there's a consideration. One of the ways people do like to change, the air conditioner is a good example. We talk about universal health care. What if we had universal energy so that I don't have to worry about any bills, and then everyone's quick to change because if I'm going to get it for free, sure, I'll change it. And because in some ways I just say to myself, Con Edison, we spoke about electric, the utilities. Like, who's the keeper of all this money that we have to continuously feed and churn? And if there was a universal, a universal energy plug, then maybe we have to forcibly change because it just will be given and you're happy to take your free energy and be happy with it, or distribution, and we can control. Anyway, that's just a theoretical consideration. Universal health care, I'm thinking, and then I think universal energy. Is that possible? Is anybody doing it in the world?
Mm-hmm.
And what part of the world is most prosperous can we cite from the panel? I would like to hear that is like a great example of, Peru has great weather, we have the blue zones, but like, is there any other example? Because here we have the cluster of like a forcibly built city that was the prime example of the history of the Industrial Revolution. So now we created all these buildings that have all these dysfunctions, and we're kind of undoing that. I just see these kind of things, whereas, the land is balanced without all this infrastructure. These are some of the fundamental things I see that we're talking about.
I think it's interesting that you talk about this universal energy. So one thing that a lot of older buildings have is one electric meter for everyone in the building. It's actually something that most energy people are trying to stop. We're trying to actually individually meter so that people will be knowing and responsible for the amount of energy they're using, instead of just using a ton of it without really having to pay for it at all. So it's an interesting idea. I know there's like Iceland, they have maybe universal energy. I don't know. I think they're in very good shape there. There's some countries that are blessed. We unfortunately are not. If it could be universal energy with the idea that, you're using your piece, maybe that's a way to do it. But energy's expensive, so.
I also think it's an interesting idea. Perhaps there's like a target EUI, or target energy use intensity, that you can a maximum cap of that free allowed universal energy service, and therefore that would incentivize buildings and people to just use up to their cap.
Because one of the things I find is that there's like, you just look around outside when we walk outside or wherever you go, in the most problematic areas, we end up with fires, gas explosions, etc., because there's this web of cross lines, and it's like some of these lines are dead, and then we're going to put this one a 440 volt because the
Okay, excuse me, I think we need to have a question in the back.
The question is, how can one thing mitigate all those cross wires?
I don't have an answer for that. What I was thinking about, though, is like in Copenhagen. So they have a plant where they burn all their waste, they create steam, and they dug up all their streets and put pipes in, and every building plugs into the steam pipe, and they get their heat. And I'm sure they're paying for it, but all of a sudden it's kind of like equalized everybody's energy systems by creating this large grid. Not remembering the name of what that technique is, but in any case, it is there are ways to kind of deliver like that make it feel more equivalent or universal. It's a great question, and like I was saying before, take that problem, ponder it for a while, be delighted with what you come up with.
This question pertains to what Alon said previously, and that you said that there would be a shift in jobs in the future to place a greater emphasis on the climate and climate change as a whole. So how do you think students at the Cooper Union can start to prepare for this shift while studying here, and what do you think we should keep in mind?
So one of the things that I learned after I left school was that there are more professional societies in this country than you can count. And so, you know, you can explore that, any kind of topic that interests you, any kind of area of your major or area of your life that interests you, there's probably some group of people who are working on it now. So it's an advice that I give everyone. You know, look for these organizations. They're kind of your door, your entryway into that topic. It's a bunch of people who are really interested in the topic. They usually have really good information. They're usually really, really, really happy to get young people interested in and joining their organization. So I think that's a big piece of it. And just, like I said before, like, don't limit yourself. Just explore everything. There's, you know, it's the biggest onion you can think of. There's just so many different topics out there.
If there's conferences on your topic, I would say, you know, borrow money if you have to and start showing up. And the most interesting speakers, sit down next to them at lunch and start talking to them, create a relationship. It's just the coolest thing.
Another layer there, yeah, sit down with them at lunch and commiserate and learn and ask questions, ask. But those industry organizations also tend to have technical committees or standards committees, and those are no cost to attend. The public are invited. There are occasionally a closed meeting on sensitive topics, but the American Society of Heating, Ventilating, and Air Conditioning Engineers that I've been involved with, ASHRAE, the technical committees are open. They have subcommittees on every aspect of building science. They help create the equipment that the architects are and write the standards for and measure the efficiencies of that the architects are using in buildings as they get constructed. They're not easily findable. You got to ask at the desk and find the technical committees or whatever, but sit in on them and then hang around afterwards to speak with the most interesting attendees that you heard speak there.
I would add that as a student, you have a lot of leverage on being heard. So it's not only about attending and finding places outside of the school, but bring people to the school. People like to give conferences, attend, and you know, talk about their topics of specialty. So if you and a couple students organize a session or are part of the Climate Cooper Initiative, you can also bring people to the school, and I think that's a great resource that students have, that once you graduate, you're not going to be able to just like call people up, like your favorite author, and be like, can you bring in, come and give a lecture in my living room or to my friends? But here you can call your favorite authors and be like, okay, I want to like make a panel and bring people together and talk about this issue because we're interested in this. So I would tell you to kind of like take advantage of these 5 years or 4 years that you're here to do that.
Yeah, I did want to mention that sort of heard a seed of this. You know, we alums put together this climate initiative, but I think as a body of students, you can also form a student climate group. I think it existed at one point, and I don't know, maybe I'm unaware if it's actually active right now, but I think this is such a powerful topic, and I sense, well, of course, you attended, so you're very interested in this topic, but I think it would be great if we had sort of a parallel group among the students bonding over this topic as well. Okay.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I mean, Marshall and Lynn, this is kind of a visionary thing they're doing here, and I think there's any Cooper alumnus who's working in this field would love to talk to any student about it. You know, we're all passionate about this issue. We're passionate about our work, as you can hear from how we speak, and we always love to talk to young people and get people interested in what we're doing or anything else that you know touches on it. So I think Lynn and Marshall are going to try to continue to make an effort to make alumni who are in that field available and you know, kind of give a structure to it. But yeah, don't be shy.
No, we're not. Lynn?
We're willing to accept any ideas that you have. And underlying what we were just talking about, I think it pays to re-emphasize the point that learning doesn't end when you get out of school. It's a lifelong thing, and you can reinvent yourself at various points in your career and take off in different directions as things appeal to you and you want answers and you want to help in some area. So be open to continuing to learn and to change. Any other questions? Yeah, there's a question in the middle here.
Hi. I was just wondering if there was anything along in your career where you would have changed or done anything differently to make more of an impact than you have already. Was there anything in your career that you could have, looking back now retrospectively, that you would have done differently?
Why don't one of our senior members address that?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. I'll start. I spent 41 years as a chemical engineer, actually doing more in fluid mechanics than chemical engineering. But somewhere late in my career, I got involved with a number of projects where I wasn't managing a finite group of people, but I had a role where I was influencing all of research in my company, which is 6,000 scientists and eventually business people as well. And that required a lot of learning in management, in how to get the most out of teams. And if I had known that earlier in my career, I would have been a much more effective manager. So, yeah, my career shifted, and I actually lost some of my sharpness in the science end, but I made up for it by being much more aware of how to manage people and to get the most out of effectiveness out of teams.
Yeah, I was going to say, it's a lot of fun to talk about my journey, and my company ended up quite a success, and it's fun to talk about driving the cab and all of that. But the thing I would have done differently would have been to understand how much more than programming in Fortran 2 or Fortran 4 I needed, and I had some neat ideas. I mean, the software field was in its infancy, so you could take on almost anything. But there was so many other aspects to business. So if you have that entrepreneurial bent, just realize there's a lot of other dimensions, and I just had to learn on the job. And that may have been one of the reasons it took 35 and a half years to get out of debt. But it was, that would be my message from my own background.
It's hard for me to think of anything I would change. So I worked at the Department of Environmental Conservation for 27 years. If I have that right. Yeah, that's about right. No, yeah. And the people there are passionate about the environment. They're smart, they're hardworking, and I never thought I'd leave. I thought I'd work for one state agency my entire life and retire from there. And then I had this opportunity to move to this brand new state agency, and the people there were live streaming, so I don't want to say better, but they're fantastic. And it's a really important part of one's career is who you work with, you know, the teams you're on, and having fun at work. I mean, it's a huge part of your day for a huge part of your life. So I don't think I'd change anything. Maybe I would try to do a little more, meaning that you know, wherever you are, you have the opportunity. You usually get into a job. Oftentimes, it's somebody who's there before you, and you have a defined role, and you do your role. When you have those opportunities to do something new, or even if you come into a defined role, you can redefine it your own way, and you can do more. There are always holes to be filled in every organization. There are always opportunities to take the organization in some new direction or to enhance a direction that the organization isn't focusing on. That can make a huge difference and can make a huge improvement. So I think that's, if I was to do anything, I would do more of what I did.
My turn. About 10 years ago or so, I had an idea to start a bank called Energy Savings and Loan, where we would finance the construction of energy efficient projects. And given that my team has the know-how to actually assess an architect's set of drawings and monitor it to know that it's going to actually work, it seemed like a good idea. But it was an idea that cost me a lot of money, and I ended up, you know, losing a lot of money over that idea. So I do regret it, even though I'm happy I tried it. But it made me realize I should stay in my more creative world where I know more of what I'm doing. But it was definitely worth trying, even though it did cost a considerable sum.
Quickly for me, change in my career, I've lived life more serendipitously as to what happened. And a perfect example was high school college night, when all the colleges came to the school and you were shopping around for where you wanted to go. And I was in the hall, and there was a dark room, and I had to go in and hike up my pants. And in there was someone from Cooper Union with a slide projector. That's why it was dark. And I just accidentally came across Cooper Union, and that's how I ended up finding out about it and getting prepared for it, and thankfully getting in and doing it. So in terms of my career path, there are paths where I should have taken the path, more taken rather than less taken. But if I were to express a regret, it would be around personal life and letting work get in the way of friends and family, and maintain that balance, because those colleagues and those connections last a lifetime, and it takes a balance. And so keep your personal relationships intact.
So maybe I can talk about my future, but I think I can say things that right now I would like to incorporate into my career in the future. And I think for me, a big aspect that I don't see, I think I don't have a big reach to is the amount of impact that we do. So yes, we design great buildings, and maybe we aspire for innovation, and I love teaching, but it would be great to work in developing countries. It would be great to work directly with affected communities that are going to have the highest amount of risk and impact from climate change. And so it would be great to understand how to include that in my professional career in a way that I'm more actively engaged with social impact.
Any more questions? Okay, if there are none, then thank you for attending, and thank you, panel. And I think there are some beverages in the hallway, and you can come and talk to any of the panelists if you have a mind to.